For example, we tend to protect children more and restrict their freedoms more because we say they're more dependent and vulnerable, right? So that tends to be the assumption. Their brain is developing and they cannot make full choices and etc. So we need to protect them more. The intuition here is that this does not necessarily apply to all children in the same way. That this doesn't apply minimum wage, salaried, or in regions with very high unemployment. Vote for right-wing government, right-wing politicians that just want to cut taxes on the rich. Like, they're not even voting for their own self-interest, which is very concerning because it shows the capacity, the weakness towards manipulation that a large percentage of the population has. That if we already have a highly incompetent public already voting, what's the harm in including a couple of more?
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Jay Thakkar Show. Today we have Dr. Nicolas Brando. He is a professor at a School of Law and Social Justice in University of Liverpool. So thank you so much.
No, thanks so much, Jay, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So you've done a lot of work in ethics and especially laws related to child. How do you, what's the moral distinction between children and adult in the society, which we usually overlook? Because we usually see a lot of, we can now see that there's need for care for children in terms of what environment are we giving them, what protection are we giving them. Even too much of protection might also lead to a lack of development in certain areas. So how we distinguish with how adults and children in general?
Yeah, so I think that the best starting point in this sense is that liberal societies, but I think most societies in general, have an assumption that childhood is a natural state. So there is something in nature called a child, and we tend to add a lot of concepts and intuitions and assumptions and biases to what this concept is. But when we look at what childhood is more deeply, we realize that it's actually a social construction. And this means that different societies have different ways in which they relate to childhood. They add different elements to it. So they're innocent, caring, carefree, playful beings. And these assumptions lead to us being blind to the reality of what childhood is as a diverse phenomenon across societies and across different children. So I think that the main issue that my work tries to untangle is, instead of kind of focusing on the moral distinctions between adult and children, is trying to look at whether we are distinguishing them too much, whether we might find things in common between adulthood and childhood that might lead us to rethink how we treat individuals equally and in relation to fair principles of justice. So I think that that's the basic intuition. And you mentioned the issue of caring for the environment, and I think that is an aspect in which we have seen that children have shown a side of what childhood can be very different from what we have assumed in our heads. They are agents capable of choice, with political intentions, with activist activist needs and impulses. And this shows that they are not only passive beings that have to be protected in the household, they are actually also political and social agents that can create change. And I think that phenomenon in itself already shows us forces us to rethink how we think about children, and forces us to rethink how we're treating children in our social world.
So how does that then influence policy and societal expectations? Because I'm asking from this context because we see a lot of wars going on nowadays, and we also see that there's a lot of children would lose their family and be isolated, and later on when they grow up, they grow with the extreme idea of taking revenge, or they turn into more extremist in general. But it's not their fault, to be honest, to be in that area which is prone to war. So how would then policy and society in general should interact so that the child can also be a more productive part of the society rather than again being one of the extremists which cause the war?
Yeah, I think that it's important there that you mentioned both public policy and society, because I think that there's a chicken and an egg situation there. We tend to think there are certain factions. Politicians say no, it's up to the family to take care of the children and to make sure that they're good citizens and ethical citizens and etc. But then the family says, we need support from public institutions in order to make this happen. As you mentioned, there are situations of deprivation, of poverty, of lack of housing, war, lack of education, that it's out of the control of the family's hands. And there is a need for much more ample sensitivity towards the welfare and social supports that families need in order to ensure that children don't get veered in the wrong direction. Not only in the terms of becoming vengeful in wars, I think that war situations are some of those environments that are very difficult to control in that sense. And it's very difficult to predict how particular children will relate to conflict situations. Some, the trauma might make them even more vulnerable and protective and scared. Others, as you mentioned, might become much more vengeful and search for power or to be engaged actively in conflict. And in terms of radicalization, for example, I think that there's this aspect of the influences beyond the family and the school or the public policy that are actually being structural to how children's minds are developing at the moment. So influencers, especially misogynistic or right-wing social media, is really affecting the way that children are relating to themselves, identifying themselves and seeing others. And I'm not sure whether... So the policy that has kind of taken place in that sense will be when we need to keep children out of these spaces, which seems kind of like a quick fix for a much more complex problem. Anyone who's ever been a child knows how easy it is to fake your age to get into a social media app. And these influences will still be there. And I think that protecting children by banning them from having access to one of the most, one of the resources that they use the most to socialize for many kids and teenagers, social media, gaming, etc., are fundamental aspects of their social life and well-being. It's not all of it is wrong. They create communities, they find shared interests, and I think that we need to explore how to protect them. How to secure these spaces for them to be safe in them rather than exclude them from it.
Yeah. So like, can you introduce us to like any adaptive model for childhood, or maybe just help us with understanding what challenges are there right now in liberal theories on rights and legal status? Yeah.
So what I do in the book that was just published, basically what I try to do is to try to question the strict distinction between children and adults. So the idea is that we have always thought about children and adults as separate in terms of political and legal treatment. We have laws for children, we have laws for adults, we have a lot of basic rights and freedoms that are completely protected for adults, but which are justifiably assumed as justifiably restricted for children. And so the idea of the adaptive model that I propose is kind of to break these strict distinction and try to see the aspects that make it justified to discriminate against a group. So the type of treatment that that children receive, the type of discrimination that children receive wouldn't be accepted if we were talking about people of different races or about women. But we tend to assume that there is something particular about childhood which justifies this differential treatment, this discrimination. And what the adaptive model does is basically breaks the condition that justifies this type of more protective children into vulnerability, developmental needs, and spatial needs, embeddedness needs. So the idea is that instead of distinguishing people based on their age, that we understand humans based on their embodiment and on their spatial and temporal frameworks. The intuition is that, for example, we tend to protect children more and restrict their freedoms more because we say they're more dependent and vulnerable, right? So that tends to be the assumption. Their brain is developing and they cannot make full choices and etc. So we need to protect them more. The intuition here is that this does not necessarily apply to all children in the same way. That this doesn't apply to all children in the same way, in the same aspects. So there might be certain decisions and freedoms that some children might be able to exercise and others don't. And also there are other periods in life beyond childhood in which we might be vulnerable and dependent and in development, and that we might need the supports and protections that children get, but they don't get them. So the idea basically of the adaptive model is to try to question these strict boundaries and reflect in a bit of a more nuanced way about what embodiment and temporal development mean in terms of equality and justice. And a particular aspect of the model is the need for it for assessment to be situated in the real world lives of the children themselves. So I'm not saying that we should be necessarily fully critical of international law and international universalist principles, but I do consider that we need to question and problematize up to what point can universal principles be applied in different situations. So the needs of a little girl living in Kashmir, for example, working, a 9-year-old girl working, might be very different from that of a white 15-year-old boy living in the UK. And the adaptive model asks us to embed rights within the lived communities of the children in order for them to actually have a meaningful impact.
But then even in an individual society where average understanding or the average path of a children's growth is pretty much certain or predictable, how would then an adaptive model work in those situations where you have some special cases? But I mean, because if there's a special case, firstly it's hard to identify and verify if this is a special case and it needs a certain it needs a different treatment than what average children gets. And if that is so, then how do we policy-wise give the society or the children more rights or different rights to perform their activities? Yeah. Because that creates for UK and West it's still pretty much easier because you don't have as big of population density, but when it comes to East you also have population density, which makes it much more difficult for a legal system to identify and verify if a certain case if a certain children comes under a special case?
Yes, so I think I agree with you that I think that assessing the individual child might be more, I think that even in the UK, you mentioned that in the UK might be easier, I think that it will be difficult even in that case. And in that sense, I think that it would apply very well, particularly to cases of children that need to go to court for some reason. So these are cases in which the child will be individualized no matter what. Obviously, this wouldn't affect public policy in the sense that you mentioned, because public policy is meant to be public for a reason. It's not meant to be individualized for each particular person. And I think that in that sense, I think that at the minimum level in which it can apply is making sure that the law and policy in place is sensitive to the diverse reality of the children who are being regulated through it. So there's the issue that law tends to homogenize, and then attempts to try to treat different cases similarly. But for example, countries like India, it's such a diverse region with very diverse ethnicities, with very diverse needs, with children living in radically different situations. And I think that at least awareness of the plural needs of different types of child populations can already lead to much better policy and practice. So I repeat the issue of children who work because it's an issue that is touched in the book, but it might be that for a rich boy in Delhi working, like having the right to work as a 9-year-old is irrelevant because they have a full education, they have parents who protect them, they have a shelter and food and etc. It becomes a problem when the same restriction on the right to work is applied to a child from another region which might need some form of work to survive, which might need some form of income in order to be able to pay for their school uniform or their books or to support younger siblings or elderly family members. So I think that understanding these plural needs and questioning the idea that all children's needs aren't exactly the same, there might be some basic needs that can encompass the whole child population or the whole human population, but that there are others that might vary depending on the particular circumstances and needs of the child in different areas. And I think that would be the aspect in which it would be interesting to think how to fix it further. Mm-hmm. And you see it in some legislation. So a good example is the case of Bolivia, who wrote a new code for childhood and adolescence about 10 years ago. And they did it through public engagement with a lot of collectives of children from diverse situations. So street children, working children unions, indigenous populations from different areas of Bolivia. And the idea was to create a Children Act that was responsive and reflective of the needs and interests of these diverse populations. And the code is very beautiful because it's not let's say a homogeneous law that applies to each and every child, but it reflects kind of like the patchwork of the diverse realities of different children in the country. And I think that's kind of like the direction in which the model that I propose intends to go.
Right, that seems interesting. And I mean, from what I think is like, should society in general then would be given some rights to sort of create a different environment for that particular child in general? Because I mean, giving right to society is almost like trusting how people in crowd or in general would behave for a certain specific case. Mm-hmm. So what do you think of that, going from a distinction of children and adults?
So I think that there are certain distinctions that do stand and that do need to be, that there needs to be division. But I think that the problem is that we add too much content to this distinction, and I think that there are other aspects in which radically more equal treatment is necessary in order to do justice for children. The first case that comes to mind would be in terms of the right to vote. So children across the whole of the world, I mean, except a couple of countries that allow 16 and 17-year-olds to vote, all children are disenfranchised. And this is because of stereotypes and assumptions about their political incompetence, their weakness, their capacity to be manipulated, their lack of experience. And these are the basic assumptions why we restrict the right to vote to everyone under a certain age. But if we start looking at the particular reasons why their rights are being restricted, we notice that it's kind of like painting with a very thick brush. So I think that going back to the example of the climate activists, they are a very good example of very politically aware, politically knowledgeable, experienced political actors that in many ways are much more politically conscious and knowledgeable and competent than many of the adults around them. Seeing how many of the elections and the capacity for manipulation by populist parties across the world, in Europe, in the US, in South America, in South Asia, the capacity of manipulation of the adult population shows that, I mean, this is not a trait exclusive of childhood. If we're gonna disenfranchise people because of incompetence and manipulation, maybe we should actually disenfranchise more people than they are. So we end up kind of being trapped between, do we actually think that political incompetence or lack of full knowledge about the political system and about the candidates, is that a sufficient enough reason to restrict the right to vote? If we say yes, then my intuition would be then we should disenfranchise a lot more people. Because, I mean, it's very clear that there's a lot of people that don't have the least idea who they're voting. They vote for a color, they vote for a hair, they vote for a name. They don't vote for actual policies or for what's best for them. And that seems terrifying. Like, I don't think that that's what democracy should be. Democracy should be power for the people. And if we take it seriously, then it means that political incompetence or lack of full knowledge of politics might not be such a big deal. And that if we already have a highly incompetent public already voting, what's the harm in including a couple of more? And treating younger citizens more equally by giving them political rights. And this becomes very important, especially in states in which the child population is very big. You think of a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, especially West sub-Saharan Africa. There's many countries that more than 50% of the population are under 18 years old. So how can any democratic election in a country like that be legitimate if, by law, more than 50% of the population is already excluded from having their voice heard? They are the ones that move the economy. There is the ones that are in the streets. They're the ones that take care of their siblings. They are actors in their own rights, and it seems problematic to exclude them just for the sake of excluding them. So I think that the right to vote is one of those examples in which I do think that the distinction doesn't work, and that we need to think of alternative ways of either of how does democracy work or the types of rights that we ensure to the people that are currently disenfranchised.
Right, but I mean, what I think is the another reason that would come as a counter argument would be that because children, on an average, are more isolated, especially children under 18, are more isolated in terms of their environment and exposure than an adult, considering them going to schools and colleges isolates them to a certain degree in terms of what they experience, in terms of what kind of people they meet, in terms of what diversity they are exposed to. then being exposed to a working environment where they are in a certain industry, they know what problems the industry faces, an employee faces, and so that increases the amount of exposure an individual has than the children, and that I think would be more valuable for a person to vote if they know, because what children would vote on an average in terms of their experience would be more inclined to changes required in education as an industry than more industries in general on an average when it comes to an adult voting.
Yeah, I think that that's an interesting point, but I do think I have the feeling actually that the fact that they are in the schooling system actually is it's a benefit for the political system that the rest of the population doesn't have. And what I mean by this is that as opposed to the standard, let's say, 40-year-old minimum wage worker that just goes to their job and comes back, these are kids that spend 8 hours of their day obligated to learn. So schooling systems can be, in an ideal world, a place in which we can provide them with the tools, with the resources, engage in debates. They actually have time to become politically competent. I do think that there's an aspect of experience, and there is an aspect of experience of the labor force that a child doesn't have. But a child also has experience as a child in the things that affect their population. Many of the issues that might affect, the best example again is climate justice. So there are a lot of issues that children are much more aware of their urgency than the adult population. The adult population is not voting. The adult population is not affected as strongly in terms of voting demographics, in terms of climate justice and climate change. The child population is much more concerned. And this is, I would say, the biggest issue that we have to deal with, at least in the next 50 years. And it seems absurd that the epistemic standpoint of the people who are much more aware and who will be much more impacted by this are completely excluded from the conversation. Another example, it might be specific to the US, but it's a very interesting example, is in terms of school shootings. So gun reform activism has been most strongly led in the last 10 years or so by children themselves who have been attacked in schools. And gun reform law hasn't barely changed in the US, despite of the fact that more people are killed, more children are killed in schools by crazy white men than by terrorists in the last since 9/11. And so the most dangerous threat to children currently in the United States is being killed in their school. And adults don't seem to have, I don't understand how they don't have the awareness that this is an issue. And this is another epistemic standpoint that children have firsthand, and they have lived with it, and they live with the fear every day, and including their voices in these aspects would be very important as well. So I think that these are two examples in which we can think of children having an experience and an epistemic position that adults might not have, and that might actually enrich much more the democratic arena. And I think that, we don't discriminate between adults depending on how experienced they are or how much contact they have with reality in terms of voting. If I'm a hermit who lives in a mountain and just goes down from the mountain every 4 years to vote and goes back to my mountain, I still have my right to vote, despite that I'm completely unplugged from society. So I think that we tend to apply a different standard for when we talk about how much we expect from adults to know or to be involved in order to vote, and how much we expect from children. And I think that different standard is what's mostly problematic.
Interesting, yeah. So in your other work, you've talked about the you talk about what distinguishes right from wrong in terms of some real world challenges specifically for child development in education. So like can you just help us throw more lights on that?
Yeah, so I think that at least in my latest work, I've tried to be very pragmatic with the way that I engage with right and wrong, in the sense that I think that one of the problems that we've fallen into, at least in international law and in a lot of political philosophy that works on issues of justice, is that there is this moralism that this is right and this is wrong, objectively and absolutely, and across populations and societies. So what we call ideal theory, like this would be the ideal society and this would be the right society. And in my latest work, what I've tried to focus on is on exploring the nuances of justice and the nuances of how we understand right and wrong, depending in non-ideal circumstances, and how do we understand these distinctions when it becomes messy. It's very easy to say, well, in a perfect world where everyone is rational, this is how we should behave, or this is what we should provide to children. But that ideal universe will never exist. So what's the point? At least if we want to engage philosophy that can be applied and that can be useful for politicians, for lawyers, for sociologists, for practitioners, we cannot work in an ideal context. We need to try to utilize the philosophical tools and methods that we've learned and try to engage with the messiness of life with them. So this is basically what my work tries to do in this respect, and which leads to very unexciting answers. Because it's like, well, is children's work right or wrong? It depends. It depends on the context, depends on the particular circumstances. I do still think that philosophy has a role to play, even in the messiness. I think that we have a control of concepts. We're very good in analyzing and dissecting messy aspects of real life and disentangle potential confusions in the way that things are mentioned and discourses are constructed in politics and in law. And I do think that through philosophical methods we can kind of clarify part of this messiness and provide support for, let's say, more practice-based researchers or practitioners in order to make more meaningful policy. In the work that I'm doing at the moment, I basically, the question between right and wrong basically relies on what could be called the reflective equilibrium. So I don't attempt to tell you from a absolutist standpoint whether something is right or wrong, but I try to explore whether a particular circumstance or law or policy is right or wrong in relation to the general principles of justice upon which that policy is supposed to stand. So in my work on liberal theory, the intuition is that we have two basic principles that ground liberal political systems, namely basic freedom for everyone, like a presumption on the side of freedom, and basic equality, like non-discrimination. And the idea of this project is kind of to test up to what point are particular policies and laws within the liberal political system consistent and coherent with these general principles. And so I mentioned pragmatic in the sense that I'm not saying whether something's right or wrong objectively. I'm saying if you believe in these principles, this policy is either inconsistent with it, thus wrong, or this policy is consistent with the general principles, thus right, So I wouldn't judge it from outside. I wouldn't say that it applies anywhere else. But I think that we have to start at least with consistency and then start thinking beyond it.
Right. Fair enough. And like, do you think the current education system are good enough for children to become ethical agents in a democratic society? I mean, before going to that, I still have this question. I mean, this is not related to your work, but I just want to know it personally. It's like, do you think in terms of proper functioning of any government, is a good leader with absolute power better than a decent democratic government?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that I would be all in for a benevolent dictator if that actually existed. The thing is that we've had so many quote-unquote benevolent dictators which actually don't turn out to be that benevolent after all. I don't think that the general population is the best place to judge their own interests. And that might go back to the question of education that you were mentioning just before this one. I have the feeling that it's not that we're intrinsically incapable of choosing for ourselves the best that's for ourselves, but we've never been provided the actual tools and resources to do it properly. So I would say that as it stands right now, I have very little trust in democratic systems leading to just outcomes. I think that we kind of see it with how elections usually go. But I don't think that realistically a benevolent dictator is the solution. I think that the solution, going back to the question that you just asked, is we need to think better. How can we provide the tools and resources and supports and education very early on in an individual's life for them to be able to actually become meaningful political actors, not only for the good of others, but for the good of themselves. I mean, we tend to judge people who vote wrongly in the sense of, oh, they're voting against immigrants, they're terrible. But many people also don't vote in favor of their own interest. Like you see when minimum wage, salaried, or in regions with very high unemployment, vote for right-wing government, right-wing politicians that just want to cut taxes on the rich. Like, they're not even voting for their own self-interest, which is very concerning because it shows the capacity, that the weakness towards manipulation that a large percentage of the population has. So I do think that education systems should have an important role to play in not only in building ethical beings as an individual, but in providing the tools and capabilities needed for becoming better political actors and better social actors. There is obviously the issue that, I mean, education tends to be like a rabbit out of a hat for everything that we don't know how to solve. Oh, education can solve it. And in a sense, this is kind of one of those cases because this opens up an important question, which is how can we make a meaningful, ethical, and politically constructive education system without political biases or ideological biases or religious biases? And I think that that's a very difficult balance to make, like how to provide the tools without necessarily manipulating from very early on. Because you see it, thinking, for example, in the case of Florida, where in the US, where they have changed a lot education laws. They've restricted a lot of books and restricted the type of discourses that can be taken in the classroom. They have banned critical race theory from being taught in their schools. And they say that this is because they are trying to build more ethical children. You know, the future citizens of Florida should be more ethical and more in line with what's right and what's American. But then you see, I mean, what they're doing is hiding half of history, repressing individuals who might not abide by heteronormativity, treating girls as second-class citizens. So it's kind of difficult to find a balance. So because if I were to do it, I would probably go in the opposite direction. No, we need to read more Marx in class. But I think that it would fall to the same trap. Up to what point am I providing tools, and up to what point am I actually limiting a person's capacity for thought? So we need to think. I mean, I think philosophy has an important role to play there. And it's very sad that you see that they're cutting a lot of philosophy in schools in early education. Because it usually what it does, it doesn't give us answers, it provides us with questions. And I think that, and with critical tools that allow us to analyze reality and analyze ourselves. And I think that this is more of what we need. Instead of being given answers, we need to learn how to ask questions and to be more critical about it.
Right, indeed. And also, I also feel that it's also tricky places, because when we kind of restrict children from things, for I mean I'm just taking a very decent example, like if we restrict children from getting exposed to extremist ideologies, they would later, because when they go out of the cocoon of education system, they will be exposed to neutral identities, extremist identities, and there is a chances of the children's going into extremism, and then they would turn out to be less productive for the society. So I think if there's a good system being placed where children are exposed to real world catastrophes, but in a safe environment where they know the consequences of being in either this or that, and would give them a better understanding of how to choose and what to choose. So even if they don't get voting rights early on, when they choose better.
I think that you make a very good point, and it's very in line with how I think about the topic. I think that shielding children too much from reality can have this adverse effect. I mean, you can think it in a very simple example. There are certain societies that are a bit more flexible, for example, with drinking alcohol from younger age. In the Mediterranean, for example, like you give a little glass of wine to your son, and blah, 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 and they kind of slowly but steadily adapt to the reality of drinking. There's others in which, unless you're 21, you cannot drink a drop. And then when they turn with 21, they go wild with this freedom that they had never had before. And I think that this exposure, is this safe exposure to reality, is an important aspect of becoming a much more resilient and autonomous human being. It not only affects drinking, it affects everything. Like we need to talk about the issues early on in order to make sure that they have the weapons and the tools in order to protect themselves by themselves afterwards. And so in my work, I rely a lot on the work of John Dewey in terms of education and the educational practices that should be followed. He's very adamant of the idea of experience being a core element for education. So he doesn't consider that by providing information passively to a student will learn. It is through testing things for themselves, from making mistakes, taking risks, and learning from them, that we actually create much more meaningful learning experiences. And I do think that that's the right way to go. And there's a lot of developmental psychology that supports this. So Vygotsky's concept of scaffolding, for example. So as freedom with scaffolding means that you are allowed to do in a place in which you have the support of their community and of others who can make meaningful choices, but always providing the space for freedom and autonomy and experience, and let's say the freedom to make mistakes and learn from them.
Right. So it was lovely talking to you. Do you have any questions for me?
No, it's great. It has been great talking to you, Jay. I hope that it keeps on going well. And whenever you want to talk more, I'm more than happy to be a guinea pig.
Sure, definitely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jay.
Thank you.